Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. In the last part we did some setup for this 3-day cycle across Termina, and now we're in our third dungeon, the Great Bay Temple. Being in the ocean, of course, you're probably thinking this is this game's water temple, and by and large you're right in terms of its complexity and theming. And in terms of the general fan reaction to this place isn't very well liked on the whole. Which I honestly find to be a bit of a shame, because honestly, nowadays, this is probably my favorite dungeon in the game. Both in terms of how you get through it, the ability set you use in it, but also because I think out of all of the 3D Zelda water dungeons thus far. What's wrong returning to shore? It's not shameful to retreat. That in and of itself is a strategy. Alright, climb onto my back. By the way, you can use the turtle to get back. We just hook shot onto the trees again. And here's the first Stray Fairy. This does the best job, I think, of using the water itself as a part of the dungeon rather than being an annoying part of it than any of the other 3D Zelda water dungeons. Because usually, it's just kind of annoying to work with. Whoa, that's a huge waterfall. Like, let's look at the water temple, for instance. The main gimmick of the water temple is you raising the water up and down, going through the maze of the area itself. Twilight Princess. Your whole goal is to move the water flow in that, which, fine in and of itself, but you have to work around the water rather than using it as a part of the dungeon itself, and that's just kind of boring. Without saying too much about the game itself, Tears of the Kingdoms was kind of weak. In fact, I'd say it's arguably the weakest part of that game by and large. What else? You know what, actually, now thinking about it, like, the second best 3D Zelda water dungeon is, I think it was called the Ancient Cistern in Skyward? The one that had Kaloctos as the boss fight, I think. It's been a hot minute since I played Skyward Sword, so I don't quite remember. I don't like the game, because I know a lot of people don't. It's more that came out in early high school for me, when I was already experimenting around with a lot of other games, so I just didn't get a lot of opportunities to replay it like I did when I was a kid for this, Ocarina, Wind Waker, Twilight, and all that jazz. So, in this room, we actually have a couple of not Great Fairies, Stray Fairies we can actually grab. There's one beneath the entrance platform, but there's also one in that skull shell all the way up there, which you can just snipe from a distance with an arrow, thankfully. If you actively go over to that platform that's below that skull shell, there are plenty of rupees on it, but I don't have a reason to get those anymore, because I already have the 5,000 total for that piece of heart. So nowadays, rupees are just for buying things, which there's not even that many times I need to do that left in the game. So this first room sort of introduces the main mechanic of the dungeon. It's pipes. We are going to be rotating switches to allow water to flow through pipes to power certain machines, like that little yellow water flow we just stepped on, to allow us to progress further in. I get it. That huge waterfall is powering this thing. And here in the central room of the area, we got a gigantic whirlpool machine with smaller passageways to the left and right parts of it that we need to worm our way through with the Zora Link. And also there's a pot at the very bottom of this that contains a Stray Fairy. You can get this with Zora Link by just going to the center down there, but it's technically just easier if I just use an arrow and let it come to me while I go get one of the other Stray Fairies. The thing with this dungeon that can be kind of annoying for a water dungeon, and this is sort of just a theme with them in general in the series, is there's a lot of times where parts of the dungeon are just inaccessible unless you backtrack to another thing and get something else done. Similarly to, like, in the water temple, you need to play Zelda's Lullaby in front of those 3 Triforce marks to raise the water to the 3 different heights. And in Ocarina, you had a good way to get past some of that by using Aurora's Wind, if you had that. In this, you don't have that, but you don't really need it either, because it's designed in such a way, like the other dungeons, to be completed quickly enough that you can not have to worry about massive backtracks. With that said, out of all the dungeon themes in the game, I find this one to be the funniest. If only because of the very stock metal slamming sound effect that's in it, that I think even Conker's Bad Fur Day used for when you, like, use the frying pan as a weapon. There's just something about hearing that in a Zelda game that's absurdly funny to me. So for right now, we want to climb onto this platform near this water and hookshot over to this chest in order to get the first of our usual 3 items for the dungeon, and one that on a first playthrough can be pretty handy, at least in terms of visualizing what's in what direction, the usual map. Because not for nothing, I might have this dungeon basically memorized at this point, But on a first run, because of the literal whirlpool machine in the center of the dungeon, it is very easy to get turned around and forget what rooms are in what direction from you. So having that on hand to visualize that can help a lot. I kind of underestimate the importance of the map as a kid, because as a kid I only really just tried to wander around and never really used it besides the mini-map. But no, actually looking at the map screen can do a lot to help you, especially in games with larger dungeons, or at least in terms of complexity, like this, like some of the later ones in Twilight Princess, or from memory, especially the ones with the Skyward Sword. Also, a moment ago, we actually had a debut of a new enemy, Dexy Hands. They're these weird, ghostly little hand things that I assume are sort of meant to be a counterpart to the dead hands from underneath the well. They actively don't really hurt you that much. If anything, they do like maybe a heart of damage. Their annoyance is, if they grab you, they swing you around and then just throw you away. Zora and Link can completely ignore that by using your electrical barrier, but if you just swim and use that, you don't have to worry about anything. But there are a couple cases where they actually can be helpful, but we'll talk more about that as we go through the rest of the game. Kill all the Biobabas in this room and a chest spawns in. This contains our next Stray Fairy. This is probably the one I've forgotten the most in this dungeon, if only because usually rooms like this don't tend to have an important item, at least in terms of like their little setup with how thin this is. Usually these types of rooms are just to have enemies in your way more than anything. But that's also something I do kind of appreciate about Majora's Mask. By and large, every room in a dungeon has a purpose, either for a puzzle later on in the dungeon, for a Stray Fairy, something like that. It's not like even some of the other 3D games or the 2D games where at most there's maybe like a single gold skulltula, or just rupees in there, or secret seashells or something like that. Because sometimes when you get towards the end of some of those games, rooms that just have items like that become a lot less important because you already have setups that are good, or you have setups that are more guaranteed. Like, you can get certain rings in the Oracle games that are much better than just the random ones you can find about by doing certain side quests. Also, I should note, if you're playing along and taking things a little more slowly than I am, I actively have a time limit for finishing this dungeon, sort of. If it gets too close to midnight on the first night, I actively want to leave here, and I recommend you do as well to go rescue the bomb lady in North Clocktown. I have enough time with how I play that I can finish it no problem here, but if you're taking things a little more slowly, if you're getting towards like 10 or 11 p.m., I'd actually recommend going to go do that, unless you're actively in the boss fight. For something else we're going to do this 3-day cycle. On top of that, we're also going to want to actively go back to Ikana Graveyard on the night of the first day to wrap up anything we can do there. But we'll talk more about that in part or two. Mentally, honestly, that does honestly bring up a little bit of a thing I brought up several parts back, where I think I said sometime after Snowhead Temple that between Snowhead Temple and the after effects of this temple is over half the game's side content. And that honestly about tracks with the numbers of heart pieces we have at the moment, because we're well over the halfway point of that. But that even tracks in terms of like part number, because we're in part 20 now, if memory serves. Yeah, 20. While this LP is just over 30 parts long. So like, yeah, we got about a third of the LP left, but while a lot of that is still side content, a lot of that is also still plot progress. That Stray Fairy there you can get in two ways, either by using arrows and the Great Fairy Mask, or if down the line you're very good about timing, you can use Zora Link to get that. I don't recommend doing that, but you can do it. This room kind of makes me laugh in retrospect, because as a kid, I kind of misunderstood what to do here for like 20 minutes plus. What you have to do is the red pipe that's on the right side of the room. You need to walk up that like it's ramp. And I'm not sure if it's just because I thought the pipe would be too smooth, or I didn't think I could interact with it. I just didn't try that. Sometimes I can't tell with things like that if it's just me not being able to understand signposting correctly as a kid or what. But this definitely was a moment that took me a moment. I think the 3DS version made the fact you could do that a little more clear, but don't quote me on that. By and large, I recall Majora's Mask 3D getting some moments like the Ocarina of Time Water Temple 3DS texture fixes just to make things a little more signposted, but it's been a hot minute. By the way, time for the mini-boss. I actually recommend killing some of the choo-choo jellies in that last room for some magic and arrows. And otherwise, it's time for us to relive the introduction to the fight against Goma. Look at the ceiling. Mini-boss of Great Bay Temple is Wart. This is, I think, the only mini-boss I don't do a tattle on. But the main thing with this fight is it's divided in two phases. We have the giant eyeball that opens up and closes occasionally, which, of course, if your first thought is to shoot an arrow into that, congrats, you know how to do damage to this. But first, you gotta get all these weird little single-celled organism bubble things off of it. There's a couple of good ways to do this. Just using the quick analog spin attack is a very good way to kill several of them at once, because not only does it knock them off, but it'll probably kill ones who are trying to get back to the main warp body. But bombs and the blast mask also aren't too bad, especially if you use both of them. So like you throw bombs to get them off and you use the blast mask to kill them. You don't need to kill all the bubbles. In fact, I think technically sometimes they respawn. You just need to kill enough that you can actively shoot into the eye without being interrupted consistently, because the eye does open and close, and you need to take advantage of when it's open to a pretty good effect, at least for phase one. Once we get towards the latter third of its health, the fight does change a little bit, but for right now, this is all you need to worry about. Thankfully, it's such a big eye and it moves so slowly, you don't really need to worry about missing it either. Alright, so now things are different. Around the latter portion of its health, all of the bubbles drop off at once. I recommend just killing them just to clear out the arena. But then Ward itself will only just start charging wildly all over the room, sort of trying to hit you, sort of not. It's kind of random, it feels like. While it's charging about, its eye is still randomly opening and closing, so you do have to take a bit of a quick shot to hit it a little bit, like a certain fight in Wind Waker. It's not hard, but it can get a little dicey, especially if you're lower on health and you're running low on arrows, because it does move fast enough to have it be easy to miss, but oh well. For now, though, it's time for us to grab our dungeon item this time around, and by now you'll probably start detecting the theme for what the main dungeon items are in this game. This is the Ice Arrow. Set it to C to power up your arrows. Now you can freeze enemies and objects. Try it everywhere. So the Ice Arrows were originally an optional item you can only get way too late in Ocarina of Time consistently for them to be useful, but they are actively quite useful here, both in the Great Bay Temple and in Majora, because not only do they just freeze enemies like they did in Ocarina of Time, they can also create ice platforms when you aim them at water. Meaning you can now create any platform you need and be able to jump across long distances. With that said, these did get a notable nerf in Majora's Mask 3D. Here in Majora's Mask N64, anywhere you aim at the water, as long as it's not too close to the previous platform you made, you can make an ice platform. In 3D, you can only make ice platforms on specific glowing patches of water, and they're always going to be in very set locations. And technically that makes them a little easier to use, but it means that you're also probably going to be only forced to go through the rooms in one way, and that just doesn't feel great. Notably, they also did get a bit of a damage nerf in that in Ocarina of Time, if an enemy could be frozen by the ice arrows, they took double damage from them. In this, they do the exact same amount of damage as the fire arrows, which isn't a big deal in the long run. If an enemy couldn't be frozen by them in Ocarina, they took the same damage anyway, but it's worth noting all the same. So, we then needed to use the ice arrows to freeze that Octorok, but also push that switch, and that activates water flow through any red pipes we've seen throughout the dungeon, allowing us to actively access new areas. This is what I mean about them using water better as a mechanic in this dungeon than basically any other 3D water Zelda dungeon, in that the water's flow matters so much more than, say, the water's height. It opens up new mechanics in other rooms you've already been to. It actively allows you to completely change the way you go through the dungeon. It feels great. Water dungeons in Zelda can be good. The Water Temple just really gave a lot of them a bad name. I'd say by and large, I think my least favorite theme for Zelda dungeons, even though I'm usually a fan of these types of levels and platforms, is probably the ice ones. If only because ice dungeons tend to have, like, the same three mechanics. Like, it's slippery, there's a slippery block puzzle, all that kind of jazz. And they usually counter that by at least being pretty to look at and having some great music. or just a great aesthetic period. I'm looking at the ice dungeon in Twilight, for instance. In fact, if anything, that's probably the most unique ice dungeon in the series. Also, I think this is the only room in the game from memory that a water choo-choo spawns. Kind of interesting. This room is a little famous in the community for this game for a very particular reason. In that, by pressing this switch to its destination, the water flows through the red pipes all the way throughout the rest of the dungeon, even back to the entrance. And that is our end goal right now, but there's another room I'm going to visit on the way to grab something else. But after you grab that something else, the Prima Game Strategy Guide recommends you play the Song of Soaring to go back to the entrance, and you should do that. The problem is, they didn't say the Song of Soaring. They meant the Song of Soaring, but they say the Song of Time. If you play the Song of Time at this point, well, you're just going to reset the entire cycle and have to do everything you've done in the dungeon again so far, barring getting the ice arrows, and, whoops. Prima guides. Woefully inconsistent. I have a couple of them here and there, and I'd like the ones I have. I think I also have, like, a couple of Brady Games guides. But, by and large, I've always found good, like, game facts and online walkthroughs to always be more consistent. If only because, since they're being done by and large for free, like, there's more incentive to actually go back and change things because it's like it's a passion project at that point. For now, get the ice arrows out because it's time for our second mini-boss, and it's one that looks a little familiar. The Gecko returns. And if you remember a certain side quest we were doing a lot of work on last time, it's time for us to do a little more on that. This Gecko's a little different though. It doesn't have a snapper as a friend. It has what I guess is a giant choo-choo. The way this fight works is that when you hit it a couple times, when it's out of the bubble, all the little gel bubbles in the room will form together as a giant one, and they will form up to the ceiling and try to goop themselves on top of you. But while it's on the ceiling, just hit it with an ice arrow, it'll fall and shatter back, and you can do it again. If you actively get hit by the giant goop ball, you do take a lot of damage because you get absorbed into it, and the Gecko does a giant attack combo on you that does like 3-4+ hearts of damage. But the arrows you're using do enough damage that this fight is over pretty quickly. You have to say though, this is a really well-animated model for the N64. In general, like, I think first-party N64 games, rather, at least, on general, had better animation than, like, first, second-party PlayStation games. Like, I look especially at this giant bubble and Morpho from the Water Temple in Ocarina. Like, those are far better animated, especially as water, than anything on the N64 or even Dreamcast. Which makes the fact that the entire reason that water was a big thing in Sonic Adventure, the fact they wanted to get something that only the Dreamcast could do well, kind of funny. Considering that was the next generation of hardware at that point. Time for this thing to die. And there lies our final frog for the Don Garo side quest. So get out your mask and talk to it, and if you've done everything we did last time, once we finish this dungeon, we'll be able to head back to the mountain village and finish that side quest up. In fact, from memory, I think that's also going to be the last quest we need to do in Snowhead, period, I think. If not, it's pretty close to the end of that. Actually, I think it is, because I think we've also wrapped up Southern Swamp at this point, from memory. And our reward for that is the boss key. I think it might be now that the Prima Games Guide does the wrong song recommendation. It actually might be after the next step I do as well. I can't quite remember. Not a bad time to do it in either case, though. I want to say there's a trick speedrunners do to get into that room early so they can completely skip the Gecko fight, probably involving some form of bomb jumping and hovering. It's been a while since I actually watched a Majora's Mask speedrun. The last thing I remember watching with that, I forget if I mentioned this earlier in the LP, but sometime in the last couple of years, people found a way to use some arbitrary code execution to activate the game's debug menu that the devs used. And that just allows them to get a lot of stuff very quickly. That was the last thing I remember seeing from this. I don't even think it's actually been at a GDQ since. It's probably been at one and I just missed it, or it's been at an ESA or something. I do watch GDQs, but I don't watch them nearly as, like, religiously as I used to. Like, I remember even during my Minish Cap LP bringing up that I was watching at the time, the VODs for Awesome Games 2013, I think? Something like that. So right here, now that we're back at the entrance, bringing the water through all the red pipes activates this little water platform that you can hookshot to the top of, which will allow us to activate this switch here on the far left side of the main room. Well, I call this the entrance. Technically, this is the second room, but I always consider this the real entrance because it's where the dungeon actually starts, barring getting the first Stray Fairy. Not a bad time to get the Stray Fairy we got from the Skull Show, too, if you didn't get it earlier. Turning this will activate the final red pipe, which activates another water current that, when you have both the yellow and red activated, completely stalls the motion of the turn wheel in here, also stalling the whirlpool in the previous room. Thing is, though, now to actually get back in there, you need to turn the yellow off, thus reversing the whirlpool's current in the main room, allowing us to access other directions that we couldn't before. This does technically reverse other things, like the platforms raising up and down in this room, but that's no big deal, really. But before we actively go back into the whirlpool itself, you may have noticed earlier this video, in the whirlpool room, there's a door on the far side of the top of it that we haven't been able to access yet. You actively need the ice arrows to get in there, because there's a waterfall in front of it coming down from the ceiling. We need to shoot that with ice arrows to stop it from happening. Yeah, that does get into something that I find kind of interesting. By and large, all the dungeon items in this game are themed around the arrows. Like, we got the bow and arrow back in Woodfall. We got the ice arrows in Snowhead. We get the ice arrows here. And if you follow a pattern, you might be able to figure out what we're probably going to get in the next temple. Well, I'll save that topic for then. I think actively using it as a chance to just expand one of the most important Zelda items is interesting. Because you by and large get all the major items through doing side areas in the game, and I think that's pretty neat as a concept that allows you to also use the other item for the entirety of the main dungeon of that area. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 21, we're going to go finish off the Great Bay Temple. See you guys then.